Betsy Lucal is someone all of you know. She is a celebrated professor and teacher here on our campus. And the talk that she's going to give us today comes from a sort of hilariously only academics would work this way kind of prize. That is, she won the teaching award, oh God, can I remember how to say this name? The 2013 Hans O. Mausch. There's a whole lot of letters in that. Those Germans, okay. Award for distinguished contributions to undergraduate teaching. And when you win this award, the wonderful prize is that then you get to write a lecture. Yay! Which is then published in a major journal of the field. Dr. Lucal, I don't know if you'll say a little bit about this, delivered this in San Francisco in August. So maybe that's something for the Q&A to talk about the reception there. Dr. Lucal has a very long biography here. She's the former chair of the American Sociological Association section on teaching and learning, the section on sex and gender, former chair of the Committee of the Status of GLBT Persons in Sociology. She is currently the at-large director for the Midwest Sociological Society. She's a member of FACET, winner of the Trustees Teaching Award, the IUSB Distinguished Teaching Award, the All IU Sylvia Bowman Award for Excellence in Teaching. I'm going to pass out. So really long and fabulous bio here, wonderful contributor to the university. So please help me welcome Dr. Betsy Lucal.
Thanks to all of you for coming to hear this lecture. As you can see, it now has a different name. And the actual name includes teaching sociology, but really what I'm going to say is relevant to teaching more generally. It's just going to be published in a journal called Teaching Sociology, and my editor and I were trying to get a title that would get more hits than the original title, and so that's what you have. So the other thing that I would remind you of is when I gave this lecture, it was to a national audience, but I talked about IUSB. And so now I'm going to be talking about our institution and our students instead of my students. So, and I am going to read. I'm a theorist, and so I want to make sure that you hear my entire argument. And it's also true that the last time I gave this talk, I cried. So that could happen again. So just so you're warned. So, students at our university succeed despite the institution that is charged with educating them. They succeed even though they live in a society that pays lip service to equal opportunity and then tells them it cannot afford to educate them because other priorities are more important, that government is too big and taxes are too high. They pass their classes and manage to graduate despite the transformation over the last 3 decades that has significantly changed the US system of higher education, and is most evident in the fundamental shift in how education is funded, with an increasing share of the cost borne by students and their families, and a rapidly decreasing amount paid for by states and the federal government. Our students succeed despite these obstacles being placed in their paths. Consider my student Judy, who told me she did not want special treatment. She did not want me to allow her to turn in late work without penalty because it wouldn't be fair, even though her work was late because of chronic illness and her lack of health insurance, appropriate medical care, and access to needed drugs. Or consider my other student, Tess, whose financial aid appeal required me to certify as acceptable her plans to take 2 summer courses that overlapped in both their days and times. We both knew it was unrealistic, but I told her since I was teaching one of the courses that we would figure out how to make it work if she was actually held to that plan. Did it really matter if she finished in August or December? Well, those are the rules. In her ethnographic study, my freshman year, What a Professor Learned by Becoming a Student, University of North Carolina anthropologist Kathy Small reports that she left the field with a number of insights into her students' lives. One eye-opener for Nathan was realizing that her largely traditionally aged students were juggling many balls simultaneously, so her class was just one of their many priorities. I quickly translated this lesson to the lives of our students. For many of them, having only to juggle the balls kept in the air by Nathan's students would seem comparatively easy, as many are full-time workers, as well as provide care to partners, aging parents, and/or children. And not all of our students, of course, are in good mental and physical health. Consider Vera, who in addition to her classwork navigated the complexities of managing a full-time job, sick parents, and mental health issues of her own. I've had multiple courses with her, and she has had the potential to be a successful student, but the predictability of her academic difficulties was disheartening. Each semester she would start off strong, but then she would disappear from class, sometimes never to be seen again. Sometimes work would appear, but I would never actually see her. Finally, at the end of a class in which she had managed to turn in quite a bit of the work, I gave her an incomplete. With a bit of extra time, she easily completed the course. I implored her not to put herself in the same situation again. She did finally graduate, and when I ran into her recently, she spoke enthusiastically about her plans eventually to go on to graduate school. Any reasonable person would agree that her persistence in the face of these obstacles was impressive. But what about Kiera, who called me to find out how to drop all of her classes one semester because she and her children had become homeless? She was still determined to succeed, even after I had told her that the associate's degree she was so proud to have earned came from an unaccredited for-profit college, Brown Mackie, and our institution would accept none of those hours in transfer. How long was she able to persist? Persistence has become a buzzword at our institution. Thanks to Gay Tuckman's book, Wanna Be You, Inside the Corporate University, I know why I have felt so wary of it, even though so many of our students are exemplars of persistence in their quest to graduate from college. But instead of empowering our students to persist in the face of the many real obstacles they encounter, persistence turns out to be another empty promise. Advise students to take 15 hours a semester, we're told, because that's the only way they can hope to graduate in 4 years. As one of our colleagues noted at a meeting, it would be irresponsible to counsel many of our students to attempt that many credit hours in one semester. It would be nothing less than a recipe for disaster because there simply isn't room for 2 or 3 additional balls in that student's already precarious juggling act. The 2 or 3 courses they will take already put them one child's illness, or a parent's impending homelessness, or their own mental health crisis away from certain disaster. Should one of these events occur, they may have to drop a course too late to get a refund, or they may have to take a lower grade than they were hoping for in one course because they need to prioritize another that they are attempting to pass for the 2nd or 3rd time. Why do administrators think more credit hours is the answer? Because our state has decided to incentivize us, which is another scary buzzword, based on 4-year graduation rates. As most of you know, the amount of funding our institution receives from the state is now based in part on the percentage of our students who can achieve a goal that is both arbitrary and unlikely. Students who graduate from college in 4 years are students who most closely approximate the pre-GI Bill college population. Privileged students whose one and only task for 4 years was to go to college. Something that is, for the vast majority of our students, an impossible to imagine life. It should come as no surprise that students at selective private institutions commonly graduate on time. Such students are likely to come from elite backgrounds, to have gone to good schools, and to have gotten high grades and test scores. Most of them live on campus during their undergraduate years, and few will put in significant work hours while in college. But these are not our students. Such students are the exception, not the rule among college students today. While students at 4-year institutions, particularly private colleges and universities, get the most attention, an increasing percentage of today's students enroll at community college. In fact, as of 2012, 40% of college students were enrolled at 2-year schools. Furthermore, as Clausen and Page explain, more than a third of college students today are going to school part-time, many of them working to support themselves or raising children or taking care of sick parents, or all of these while also attending college. These are the students to whom we are supposed to recommend full-time college enrollment so they can graduate on time. In many ways, our students, and the fact that the people who are our students are even college students at all, are a testament to the strength of good old-fashioned American ideals, like the idea that by opening up educational opportunities to a greater proportion of the population, we could facilitate the upward mobility of those who were willing to work hard to earn it. During the middle of the 20th century, as a country, the US put its money where its mouth was, providing funds to expand higher education. As Clausen and Page explain, the growth of public investment in higher education paralleled the rise of a post-New Deal consensus that government, and especially the federal government, could and should play a central role not only in spurring economic growth, but in providing essential services for the American citizenry: housing, health, a safe, clean environment, and education. And there's no doubt that investment paid off, resulting in what some have called a golden age of higher education in the United States. In fact, history shows that the U.S. half-century of prosperity after World War II was anchored in the rise of the best public university system in the world. In the last few decades of the 20th century, though, the landscape began to change. Public higher education began to transition from being a key national priority to an increasingly neglected special interest. It was no longer to be defined as a public good. As April Yee explains, current education policy regards higher education as an optional, individual act of human capital investment. Studying the decline of public higher education as a public issue that has implications for people's private troubles shows that neoliberalism has played a key role in this transition. And neoliberalism doesn't simply account for why students are paying more for college and sinking farther into debt. It also accounts for why their daily lives become more complicated when college is added to the mix. Something that's supposed to improve their life chances instead becomes a recipe for disaster. Neoliberalism has had all sorts of pernicious effects on our society, so its effects on higher education simply illustrate a broader trend. Neoliberalism includes three intertwined dimensions: an ideology, a mode of governance, and a policy package. As a political and economic ideology, it celebrates free markets and consumerism, as well as individual empowerment, competitiveness, and self-interest. Its approach to government supports the devolution of state central power to smaller localized units and adopts the self-regulating free market as the model for proper government. It advocates public policies based on a DLP formula: deregulation of the economy, liberalization of trade and industry, and privatization of state-owned enterprises. Neoliberal ideology views the free market as the solution to all problems, distrusts government, calling for it to become ever smaller, and accepts the idea that the only responsible approach to taxation is to lower it. Under neoliberalism, people are to be reconceptualized less as socially connected citizens of a nation state or morally situated members of a culture, and more as self-interested competitors, self-actualized entrepreneurs, and rational consumers in a dynamic and ever-changing global marketplace. Such priorities have had dire effects on education, and on higher education in particular. For higher education, the most powerful tool of neoliberal ideology has been to stop the flow of public dollars to colleges and universities. The growing emphasis on online education, which is cheaper to provide than face-to-face courses, the expectation that departments and other units become self-sustaining, as well as the relentless budget cutting experienced at many colleges and universities are other products of the neoliberal corporatization of higher education. On our campus, for example, phone calls to some support departments now go to Bloomington rather than being handled locally. Centralization of these tasks reportedly saves money. Another hallmark of neoliberalism related to the distrust of government is a call for the privatization of formerly public services by putting them in the hands of for-profit businesses. Because again, the assumption is that the market is all-powerful and a curative for any possible ill. For example, on our campus, as most of you know, we made the decision to outsource our child care center, whose workers are no longer eligible for the fringe benefits provided to university employees. Similarly, if a state can't afford to build enough prisons, it should hire private firms and outsource this task to them. Or if higher education is pushed aside by other funding priorities, invite for-profit schools to fill the void. In fact, at the state level, funding for prisons and healthcare has been prioritized over higher education. While states cannot directly control ballooning healthcare expenditures, Clausen and Page point out that they do appropriate more per prisoner than they appropriate per public college student, with little resistance to constantly increasing the money spent on prisons. As the pie of public money becomes ever smaller, public colleges and universities are told to find other sources of revenue to make up for the losses resulting from their ever smaller slice. And so they do. At large universities like Bloomington, one effect has been to further prioritize research, particularly that which brings external funding in the form of grants. As Steve G. Hoffman observes, the chase for dollars is a hallmark of the 21st century research institution. Another effect, one that weighs particularly heavy on students like ours, has been escalating costs for tuition and fees at the very time that financial aid has shifted from being need-based to being merit-based, further disadvantaging poor and working class students. The quintessential act of education privatization, according to Andrew Ross, is to shift responsibility for funding onto individuals. The result? Students are going into greater and greater debt in order to go to college at all. These days, 2 out of 3 students getting a bachelor's degree have student debt. The staggering amounts of debt students are taking on in order to pursue college degrees has been the topic of much discussion recently. The picture painted by the numbers in this case is shocking. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, in the year 2000, states paid more for public higher education than students did in 47 states. By 2012, only 26 states could be similarly classified. Furthermore, the student share of costs at public institutions increased by more than 50% in the decade between 2001 and 2011. Ross observes that two-thirds of US students graduate with loan debt averaging $27,000 and then rapidly fall behind in their payments. 41% of the class of 2005 was either delinquent or in default by 2012. And for the 2012 class, 7 out of 10 graduates in that class had debt, and the average amount had now increased from $27,000 to $29,400. While recent concern about the escalating cost of college has been on the burden placed on students, this focus makes another kind of debt invisible. What about the loans parents take out to finance their children's college educations? According to Sally May, students are most likely to borrow to pay for college, but parents also take out loans in some families. Finally, it's important to note that this debt burden is not shared equally. For example, African Americans among all racialized groups graduate with the highest debt on average, and those in the deep South states where community colleges do not participate in the federal loan system are most disadvantaged of all. It's also imperative to keep in mind that many students burdened with college debt don't even have a degree to show for it, just bills that they may struggle for decades to pay. But it isn't just increased loan debts that result from this shift. It also means students are working more hours to afford their tuition bills, leaving them with less time to study and do schoolwork. Or they're choosing not to buy the books for a course because they need the money for something else, or they're missing classes when they think they can afford to do so in order to save money on gas, or they're taking online courses for the same reasons, even though they may have a difficult time learning in that environment. And remember, our students are the lucky ones because they made it to college at all. As Clausen and Page point out, one of the most dramatic effects of declining funding and rising tuition comes in the form of who gets to attend college. In fact, as they further explain, the university as business model, which is a product of neoliberalism, has clear implications for social class and college attendance. The bottom half of the population by income is no more likely to get a college degree today than they were in 1970. But people in the top half of the income distribution are substantially more likely to graduate from college today than they were 40 years ago. Knowing how important a college degree is to future success, but increasingly priced out of the market for public universities, low-income families are pushed into the for-profit college system with its low graduation rates and high debt burdens. Given these conditions, is it any wonder that there's an ongoing debate about the worth of a college education? Is it any wonder that students have become focused on the vocational aspects of their education rather than on the satisfaction of learning or a job well done? If you knew you were going deeply into debt in order to get a college degree, wouldn't you wonder how you were going to pay that money back? As Tuckman explains, when most students think that the only purpose of education is to get a diploma that yields a job, their learning will be decentered. I see students who've graduated from IUSB working retail jobs, serving tables at restaurants, trying to decide if the added debt they would incur to earn a graduate degree is worth it. As they struggle to find work in their field and juggle mountains of debt, do they see me and wonder if it was all really worth it? As Ross puts it, now typically saddled with debts on day one of college, students are obliged to seek out low-paying jobs to stave off further debt. They are compelled to think of their degree as a bargain for which their future wages have been traded. These are not the conditions under which a free, critical mind is likely to be cultivated. Ross, in fact, compares the current system to indentured servitude, given that workforce entrants must go into debt in return for the right to labor. In some ways, our students' needs are very simple. If they had more money, they could more easily weather the unexpected events that now cost them a semester of coursework. What else would help them persist? Better preparation at the primary and secondary level, a real social safety net that would ensure them health insurance for their kids, and enough food so they don't have to sit in class wondering how their family is going to eat for the rest of the month. And better access to reliable childcare would mean not having to miss class repeatedly when their babysitter gets sick or is no longer willing to watch their children. I had a student who had to drop my class because her husband would no longer watch their kids. Individuals' abilities to meet all of these needs have been affected by the neoliberal juggernaut. But of course, it's not just students' lives that are being constricted and constrained by a neoliberal approach to higher education. As Clausen and Page explain, the neoliberal ideology has been remarkably successful in transforming the nature of university teaching in just a generation. In their assessment, one of the most important transformations that's resulted from the neoliberal approach is the shift away from hiring full-time tenure-track faculty. And the most pernicious part of this shift to a non-tenure system of faculty is a rise in part-time faculty, especially at lower-ranking institutions. As Hoffman puts it, the transformation of the academic labor market is the most vivid site of inequality, exploitation, and power struggle in the new academic capitalist order. While some critics have focused their attention on the supposed lowering of the quality of instruction that results from this shift, I won't take that bait. First, let's not pretend that all tenure track or even tenured faculty are great teachers. Second, let's not perpetuate the myth that contingent faculty are never great teachers. It's not that simple. Do conditions associated with work as a contingent faculty member make it difficult for those instructors to do their best in the classroom? Of course they do. Their work conditions include shockingly low pay, lack of basic benefits like health insurance, the resulting need to cobble together teaching jobs at multiple schools, lack of respect from non-contingent colleagues, lack of opportunities and/or time to be involved in university governance. The list could go on. And all of these outcomes are traceable to neoliberalism, directly or indirectly. As a recent congressional report on the just-in-time professor notes, the contingent faculty trend appears to mirror trends in the general labor force toward a flexible, just-in-time workforce, with lower compensation and unpredictable schedules for what were once considered middle-class jobs. We ignore these trends at our peril, since contingent faculty members now comprise half of all higher education faculty. I want to focus instead on a couple of other outcomes that result from the decline in the number and percentage of full-time tenure-track positions. First, when there are fewer full-time faculty members, there is not less work to be done. In fact, in the neoliberal context, there is more for a variety of reasons. Second, when there are fewer tenured faculty members, there are fewer people who have the protection to speak out against neoliberal policies. When there are fewer full-time faculty but more students, there's more work for fewer people to do. Why are there more students? If a university needs to become basically self-funding, getting more students to enroll is a way to do that. As several writers have noted, getting out-of-state and international students to enroll can be an important source of money for institutions, because of course they are paying out-of-state fees. University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, half of their incoming class is from China. That is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. As a result, class sizes expand, advising loads increase, and pressure to offer online courses heightens, despite evidence questioning their outcomes in terms of student learning. In the growing audit culture that has accompanied neoliberalism, there's simply more work to do to satisfy the increasing need for accountability. And I'm glad lots of people are at the Weave workshop based on what I'm going to say next. My personal cross to bear has been program assessment. where I have navigated demands to develop, implement, and report on more and better measures of student learning, despite an utter lack of evidence that the data we're already gathering make a difference in the education of our majors. Similarly, the faculty annual report that used to involve writing narratives about the work one accomplished in the previous year now requires filling out a cumbersome electronic form that appears to have been created for ease of bureaucratic counting rather than a desire to gather meaningful information about the activities of faculty members. As Tuckman points out, outcomes like these are the unintended consequences of neoliberalism. No one had meant for the stress on research to help the university raise funds and on consumerism among students to diminish teaching, but one could trace the processes by which it did so. Tuckman again. When some major public universities receive as little as 8% of their general fund from their legislature and so much scrounge for money, teaching is decentered. For example, in 1987, at IUSB, 59% of our revenue came from state support. By 2012, only 40% did. That's a decline of 32%. At Bloomington, the change is even more striking. In 1987, the state was already providing less than half of the revenue at 46%. By 2012, the state's share had fallen to 22%, which is a 53% decline. Lest we imagine that all sectors of the university have been equally affected by the tides of neoliberalism, keep in mind that during the same period of full-time faculty decline has come a dramatic growth of administrative staff to supervise new outreach programs, devise accountability and efficiency schemes, and manage revenue flows. Why has there been a growth in this sector of the higher education labor market? Well, with neoliberalism comes managerialism, or the belief that all organizations or institutions, regardless of their purpose or functioning, can only work properly and efficiently if power, control, and decision-making are centralized in some manner in the hands of professionally trained and objective managers. One form this approach takes in universities is the hiring of individuals with business experience rather than higher education experience into key administrative positions. And no longer does being a professional mean self-oversight through the norms established by members of that profession. Why? From a neoliberal perspective, unmanaged professionals may just be goofing off, spending tax money unwisely, or pursuing their own priorities at the expense of those of the organization. I wonder how much time the average department chair, one of the positions most clearly weighted down by the demands of the neoliberal university, has to goof off or pursue their own priorities. A second outcome of the decline of the tenure system is, in my eyes, even more dire. As Clausen and Page explain, tenure itself is for the entrepreneurial administrator a nightmare. And the neoliberal university is full of such administrators as their numbers and salaries continue to rise. For tenure creates a unique class of workers at the institution who have the job security to say no, to refuse to go along, and worse yet, to speak out publicly against the actions of administrators. Fewer tenure-track hires and the resulting decline of the proportion of the faculty that has tenure means fewer people in such positions. And more than likely, it also means less criticism of the path a given university is following as it tries to remain viable in the neoliberal world. Susan Preston and Jordan Aslett explain, for example, how contractual faculty may become depoliticized for reasons of job security, with the result that the contemporary organization of the academy weakens the potential for faculty to resist neoliberalism in the university. I personally would question just how much speaking out against these trends those of us with the protections afforded by tenure are actually doing. And while we're certainly to blame for that, we aren't completely responsible for it. As Tuckman notes, because so many individual professors are caught up in the importance of their own research, the faculty as a collectivity sometimes let slide by reforms that affect teaching. And as Fisher and Stripling explain, it happens so slowly that no one really noticed at first. That's the way erosion works. It's a gradual decay. In nearly every course I teach, I make sure my students learn about paths of least resistance and paths of greater resistance, a powerful insight from the sociologist Alan Johnson. This offers one of the most potent tools I can place in my students' hands. For many, even most of our students, coming to college and persisting there is a path of greater resistance. But how rarely we acknowledge, let alone celebrate that fact. Instead, in a neoliberal context, student success is ascribed to individual hard work and smart choices, while student failure is ascribed to their own poor choices, lack of capacity, or lack of work ethic. How many of us, those increasingly rare academic birds with tenure, have taken the path of greater resistance when it comes to standing up against the excesses of neoliberalism? How many of us have said, stop, that's enough? How many of us have instead, usually without even realizing it, made our own contributions to the ever hungrier neoliberal machine that is the contemporary university? How many of us have taken the path of least resistance, only to realize later where that path actually has led? How many of us are even aware that the material-based and normative assumptions of academic life are being transformed? Tuckman's work provides numerous examples of this transformation, as do doomsday predictions about the future of brick-and-mortar universities. One of the examples in Tuckman's chapter on making professors accountable focuses on external reviews. Tuckman explains, in italics to emphasize her point, that an external review is an exercise in accountability with implications for action. And this is the point in the talk where I sigh, because I still remember how proud I was the day Carla Howery invited me to become a member of the American Sociological Association's Department Resource Group, or DRG. I had been around long enough to feel that belonging to the DRG was a prestigious honor extended only to the most qualified teachers of sociology. In other words, being asked to join was a sign that I had arrived as a mature scholar of teaching and learning. Well, one of the main tasks undertaken by DRG members is to conduct external reviews for departments and programs needing them. But reading Tuckman showed me that participating in such exercises means acting on behalf of the accountability regime that thrives in the audit culture of the neoliberal university. Tuckman explains that the accountability regime that has resulted from the neoliberal transformation of higher education has not served well either the faculty or the students. This regime, pushed by both states and the federal government, encourages rationalization, centralization, the expansion of the staff, and the decentering of the professoriate. I have no doubt that DRG members, including myself, undertake these reviews with the best of intentions, but we cannot claim our work somehow operates outside the neoliberal context. Ideally, such reviews assist departments in their quest to improve student learning, to better the conditions under which their faculty members work, and to reach other worthy goals. However, in a context of surveillance and ritualized paperwork, these reviews and the often lengthy and time-consuming self-study process that leads up to them also require an investment of time and energy that might better be deployed elsewhere, offer no guarantee that there will be any meaningful response to the results, and contribute to the growing audit culture of neoliberalism. In other words, the priorities of a neoliberal regime put me and other DRG reviewers in a quandary. We could abandon the external review project altogether, but doing so would mean that we give up the chance to assist programs in maximizing their quality. We can continue to provide reviews and focus as much as possible on conducting the review in a way that helps a program do what it wants to be able to do, which has been my imperfect personal response to this dilemma. But doing so risks contributing to the further ascendance of the neoliberal agenda. For example, I once conducted a review whose only required product was completing a standardized bubble form mandated by the state. I chose to provide the program with a narrative report as well, but I wouldn't have been required to do so. And of course, as a conscientious citizen of my department, college, and university, I must ask the same question about my involvement in other activities, like my membership on the campus-wide assessment committee, whose previous members once gave me strange looks when I asked them who was supposed to do all the extra work they were asking us to do in the name of assessment. Or my continued participation in self-auditing by, among other tasks, writing my faculty annual report to allow administrators to evaluate my work. While I'm not opposed to all forms of accountability, I question, for example, the increasing time and effort required to document my annual activities, not to mention the time department chairs must then spend responding to such reports. It might make sense to require such surveillance if there were evidence of widespread ineffectiveness ineffectiveness among faculty, or if there were a concern about the equitable distribution of large raises or other rewards. And we know that's not what it's about here. But that is not what's driving this requirement. As Tuckman explains, though, most professors do not understand annual merit reports as a form of accountability. And so proud of our ability to excel at tests, professors may not question the right of their superiors to audit and hold them accountable. Now that I do understand, though, now that I do question, what will I actually do to undermine this accountability regime? After all, it's not for nothing that Tuckman compares this regime to Foucault's panopticon. But it gets better, by which I mean worse. The cover of a summer issue of The Economist blared, "Creative Destruction and Reinventing the University." In this issue, the editors compare, quote, mediocre universities to newspapers, noting that if the market for higher education in the next couple of decades were to operate like the one for newspapers did in the last 20 years, universities' revenues would fall by more than half, employment in the industry would drop by nearly 30%, and more than 700 institutions would close their doors. They blithely note as well that, like all revolutions, the one taking place in higher education will have victims. Many towns and cities rely on universities. In some ways, MOOCs or massive open online courses will reinforce inequality both among students. The talented will be much more comfortable than the weaker outside the structured university environment, and among teachers, with superstar lecturers earning a fortune to the fury of their less charismatic colleagues. Talent and charisma are not, of course, what this transformation is all about. As Clausen and Page admit, we now live within a neoliberal paradigm with its celebration of markets, distrust of government, and hatred of taxes accepted as the starting point for all political debates. In other words, across the political spectrum, the continued ascendance of neoliberalism is taken as inevitable. And surely, by failing to act, we will fulfill this prophecy. So, how can we change higher education for the better? As Alan Johnson reminds us, the only way out is through. How can we act to rein in neoliberal policies? How can we undermine the accountability regime that has so circumscribed our academic lives? How can we improve things for our students, and dare I say, for ourselves? First, we can resist. And I'm sure some of you are not surprised to hear me say that. Consider Stephen Ward's point that what is at stake here is not just modernizing and improving universities or schools, but determining how society will be organized and by who. In other words, what is at stake is too important to be left to the continued march of the neoliberal agenda. According to Cottom and Goldrick-Robb, by convincing us that higher education is a failed experiment whose time has passed, corporate enthusiasts frame the terms of the debate such that public higher education, whose tuition and mission is mainly controlled by external actors, barely stands a chance. Don't accept the inevitability of the neoliberal regime. The next time someone touts the latest initiative to improve quality on campus, stop and ask questions rather than just riding the tide of the latest, greatest plan. As Ward reminds us, in navigating the demands that we become more and more efficient, accountable, and consumer-oriented, there is a risk of initiative fatigue when we are asked to perform more and more tasks, not just in order to perform our jobs more efficiently for the auditing reports, but also to help the organization continuously innovate and improve quality. As Tuckman explains, to thrive, an audit society must foster a culture that encourages individuals to audit themselves, or at least make themselves auditable. Because public colleges and universities use tax dollars to carry out their operations, they are audited and regulated more intensely and frequently than ever before, since they are, in the neoliberal conceptualization, dependent on private wealth and property for their existence. Refuse to make yourself auditable without asking why you need to be held accountable and to whom in a particular context. Tuckman notes that today, universities are sinking into the corporate culture. Many professors do not say what they think. When professors speak their mind, especially when they speak truth to power, they are making news. Make some news. Speak out against the neoliberal status quo. As Hamilton and Armstrong explain, if public universities are forced to rely on tuition and donations for funding, they will continue to appeal to those who can pay full freight. As any sociologist can tell you, that's a recipe for continued social inequality. As John Quiggin, writing about surviving the capitalist tsunami in the Chronicle of Higher Education, makes clear, the need for a new direction is painfully evident. More precisely, what is needed is a break with the socially corrosive and economically damaging policies of neoliberalism that have prevailed since the 1970s. In the introduction to his book, Neoliberalism and the Global Restructuring of Knowledge and Education, Ward reminds us that neoliberalism is one of the most sweeping and dramatic social experiments of the last few centuries. And the analysis I've provided here makes it plain that this experiment has failed. It has failed higher education, it has failed our students, it has failed us. And perhaps most important of all, it has failed our society, at least the 99% of us who must live with its harrowing consequences. Quiggin also explains, we need reawakening not only of the policy ideas of the welfare state, but also of the social and ethical virtues with which they were associated. As Clausen and Page remind us, the story of the past 3 decades is a story of the transfer of wealth from the pockets of the lower and middle classes to the pockets of the wealthy. But it's not just the rich who have such a mindset. Neoliberalism, with its focus on individualism, breeds this way of thinking. And in fact, Americans may be particularly susceptible to it because it's congruent with our dominant mindset that focuses on individualism. As Clausen and Page write, there's a direct connection between the rise of the university as business model, itself a product of neoliberalism, and the declining political support for higher education, especially public higher education. Furthermore, because public higher education has never been seen as a right, it has been at the forefront of the movement towards self-funding. That means students paying more. According to Fisher and Stripling, public colleges, once viewed as worthy of a collective investment for the greater good, are increasingly treated as vehicles delivering a personal benefit to students who ought to foot the bill themselves. But there is another way forward. At the other end of the spectrum, we find sociologists and others who endorse the radical idea, radical at least in the United States, that higher education, like primary and secondary education, be available free to all. While Clausen and Page recognize that in the current context, such a call may be regarded as lunacy, they also remind us that the more important higher education has become to a person's chances of success and to our society's chances to compete globally, the harder we have made it for students and families to afford a college education. In fact, in a report for the Lumina Foundation, Sarah Goldrick-Robb and Nancy Kendall make a case for providing the first 2 years of college free for all, an initiative they show could be financed using existing resources. Making public higher education freely available would mean finally committing to equal opportunity for all. Second, what we can do, teach our students to think for themselves. Many sociologists believe our discipline is essential in assisting students to become critical thinkers so they are prepared to become informed and engaged citizens. Liberal Learning and the Sociology major Updated makes this mission clear with its recommendation that departments should offer community and classroom-based learning experiences that develop students' critical thinking skills and prepare them for lives of civic engagement. Put that call into action by becoming conversant in neoliberalism and its wide-ranging effects on higher education. Then talk to your students about it. Talk to them about the real reasons their tuition bills are so high. Turn them into advocates for themselves and for higher education. So many of our students will continue to live in the communities where they grew up and or received their educations. Help them become informed citizens, regular voters, people who care about the world beyond their doorstep. In his book, College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be, Andrew Del Blanco writes that we might say that the most important thing one can acquire in college is a well-functioning bullshit meter. It's a technology that will never become obsolete. Help your students develop and hone their own bullshit meters. When college officials tell them that they cannot afford to provide better student support or must close the campus daycare center, students must be prepared to explain why they are entitled to such services, particularly since they foot an ever-increasing percentage of the bill to educate themselves. Finally, be an advocate for education, not training. Much has been written of late about the purpose of a college education, about what kind of learning ought to go on there. According to Tuckman, rather than universities being subordinated to the production and transmittal of knowledge, knowledge is now subordinated to the needs of universities for profit and recognition. And the subordination of knowledge means the subordination of teaching and learning. As Cottom and Goldrick-Robb point out, Corporatization may produce more tool and die operators faster than public higher education, but the public higher education model excels in producing learners who can adapt in the labor market when tool and die operations no longer exist. Our students need that kind of flexibility so they don't become their economically displaced mothers, fathers, grandfathers, and grandmothers who didn't know what to do when the auto and steel industries started to decline. Our students deserve the same kinds of chances to develop needed qualities of mind, things like creativity and critical thinking, that elite students have long been afforded. That kind of education truly would be revolutionary. Near the end of their book on the future of higher education, Clausen and Page ask, what is the goal of a university? The delivery of credit hours in as cheap a manner as possible, or the creation of a thinking community dedicated to the pursuit and communication of knowledge? I have no doubt what my answer to that question is. Can you say the same? Much like the scholars of teaching and learning who preceded me, the public higher education system made my career possible. In the 1980s and 90s, it allowed my parents, my undergraduate scholarships and graduate assistantships, and me to fund 3 degrees without taking on any debt. It prepared me for a career I love. It allowed me to find, as I sometimes tell my students, my Weberian calling. Will it be there to do the same for my children? I'm a proud member of the second generation of the so-called teaching movement in sociology. My former students, who are now teacher scholars themselves, are the third generation. Few of them have tenured or tenure track positions. They labor instead in the underbelly of the academic labor market. They labor in conditions so appalling that we can barely manage to acknowledge their existence at all. They are adjunct faculty making little more here at IUSB than I earned in the same position almost 2 decades ago. They are contract faculty expected to bear high teaching and service loads, but deemed not good enough for the single coveted tenure track job in their own department. Given the reality of higher education today, is it even moral to recommend to students, including those with the most passion for our field, that they pursue graduate studies in sociology with the goal of becoming a professor? Or should I cautiously support them, but recommend that they read James Lang's sobering look at life on the tenure track, in which he details the difficulty of the job at a small private liberal arts college? Take his challenges and multiply them by some factor associated with differences in context, and we have a good picture of life for our junior colleagues at public universities today. Unless something changes in higher education, unless we change something, my students could be the last generation of this movement that has meant so much to so many of us. And I, for one, would hate to see that happen. I hope you will join me in resisting this seemingly inevitable outcome. Thank you. So we do have a few minutes for questions or comments.
Can I just make a brief comment?
Absolutely.
I've been working at a university in the UK, a small university, and there were several times you said in America, for that you could have replaced every time you were in America with the UK.
Yes.
Completely.
Exactly. And as a colleague of mine said when I gave this talk originally, this stuff has all already come to community colleges. So in the US, they are even further down this neoliberal arc than the rest of us are. But it is not limited to the US by any means. Thank you for reminding us of that.
I have been saying lots of what you've been saying and agree with almost everything, except that the tool and die industry is not going away.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. That's fair. That's fair.
And it is. I've been involved a lot with our local industries,
Yeah.
and they are changing and innovating in ways that make it likely they are persistent.
And my dad was a tool and die maker, so but who had to, learn to use a computer.
The
and
CAD
this
as
sort of
well.
stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Betsy, for such a great catalog. It's wonderful. But I have a question that's really, really personal about what one person can do and the pressures of IUSB. So there's a lot, fortunately our retention's up a little bit. There's a lot of pressure on us to do whatever we can as faculty members to keep our students in the classroom, to keep them going forward. And that's not so hard when you meet a purely academic challenge with a student. But like you said, the vast majority of the time, that's not really the problem. It's not an intellectual deficit that they're suffering from.
Yeah.
And as warm and nurturing as I want to be, I feel like I don't have a toolbox to solve the problems that come at me as the person who teaches them. But I feel like increasingly the administration sort of expects me somehow to turn into this guardian angel, mother figure, mentor, who's not only going to be teaching them Roman history, but is also going to find ways to push them joyfully out of the womb successfully. And what should we be saying to the administration with all this pressure on retention as academics?
I mean, I think that's a very good question. And I think the answer is that every time they tell us to stop talking about the non-academic things that are affecting our students' lives, we have to say to them, but those are the things that are keeping them from persisting. Now, are those the only thing? Let's not pretend, right? Not all of us are fabulous teachers or whatever the case might be, right? But so often, it's not about anything that you're doing in your classroom. It's not really about anything you realistically could do in your classroom, right? And so every time our administration says to us, well, but we're not going to talk about the fact that students don't have enough money. Well, it's true that we as an institution can't solve that. But if we refuse even to talk about it, if we want to act like it's not a factor, a significant factor in the problems that our students are having, it means that we're not actually talking about the problems that are the real reasons that our students are having a difficult time persisting. And probably what it means is that we as an institution need to commit some money to doing the kinds of things that you can't do as a single faculty member as a guardian angel, right? We need student support services to do those kinds of things.
I think a very good point of that for those who've been here for forever is our traditional student rate has actually gone up, but we're seeing more problems. And part of the reason I think that non-traditional students used to be able to make it through the university and we had more non-traditional students is because we did have more support for them. And so it's interesting to see that as we get more and more traditional students, supposedly that should help us do better, and it's not.
But I think that the thing that we have to also remember is while we have more students who are traditional in the sense that they are between the ages of 18 and 24, that doesn't mean they're traditional in the sense that they're white, middle-class kids who are really well prepared for college, right? And so what we are sometimes talking about is a 20-year-old with 2 or 3 kids who is already divorced, already has childcare issues, right? And so I think that sort of this, oh, we have so many more traditionally aged students. Yes, we do, but they're traditional only in their age. And we cannot generalize beyond age to say, oh, well, then we should just automatically retain more of them. Because we all can see that that's not what's happening.
I would point out it could actually be reversed because, of course, a student who is between 18 and 24 and has 2 children to care for doesn't have well, for one thing, those children are smaller, and they also don't have a wealth of experience to fall back upon in caring for those children or in understanding what the limitations of their time and income are to achieve these other goals.
And that's what I would say too in response to it. Because Kathy, I'm not sure we've had more support in the past. And that's an empirical question, right? But what I do think is we had more students who were used to juggling multiple things. And so if you're already used to juggling 4 things, and now you're juggling 5 things, that's maybe workable. But if you're used to juggling 1 or 2 things, and now you're juggling 5 things, that's really difficult. and really difficult to do in an intense 15 or 16 week at a time fashion.
I was talking more in terms of the general support that people get.
Got it.
Like, it's costs more to go to college
Yeah.
now than it used to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
I would agree with what you're saying.
One more comment? Yeah, Stephen?
Thanks again for the talk. It was great. Really enjoyed it. And I wonder if there's any way to think about either regional or national organizations, institutions, places to look for the way in which other faculties at other universities are facing these sorts of issues, responding. Do you feel like the AAUP is a helpful force, or are they to the side? Things to read, like newsletters, blogs. Where do you go? Is the Chronicle good? How to see beyond ourselves, I guess, and organize beyond ourselves.
I don't know what AAUP is up to lately, although rightfully so. AAUP is usually focused on the faculty side of things, not on ways in which students' lives are impacted by this. Other than that, I haven't looked more widely yet. I've been focused on getting this paper done. Yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned the idea of teaching rather than training. I'm a non-traditional student, and when you said that, it rang true because students like me, we need these places. It's not about getting our bills paid on time. It's about creating a life for ourselves that we can enjoy, that we can live in this society, in this culture, in this world, feeling like we're not wasting our time. And there are even several professors in this room that I wasn't necessarily inspired to come to IUSB because I heard great rates of test scores or anything like that. I met people that either went here or that taught here, and many of them are in here now, that it was more of an inspiration that I could actually go and expand my thoughts. I could go and I could be the person that I want to be or that I have the potential to be. And if that makes a difference in somebody's opinion on how they're going to teach or how they look at students, and I know that we have a lot of non-traditional students here, and the effort that a lot of you go to make sure that we are seen is such a crucial part of our success. It's not just to come to campus and take a test and say, I'm going to get a good job so that I can retire. A lot of us keep coming back here because we feel that we belong here and that we're seen here. And the difference that can make for a professor to communicate with a student in a way that lets them know you are not the dollar amount that you are paying to be here. That, I think, really increases the chances of a student like myself coming from a non-traditional background. It really increases our chance of not only graduating, but taking what we do learn here at institutions like this and spreading that to other communities. So in terms of whether you're traditional or non-traditional, the values that really go into teaching somebody to think and to, like you said, to have these critical views of the world, it means more than a lot of us can explain. And when we're looked at like we're just a dollar amount, that does make us think, well, then I'm wasting my time here as well.
Exactly. And what you're saying is exactly where our efforts should be, right? Our efforts should be on making those kinds of connections to students rather than figuring out, for example, whether the 14th iteration of your learning objectives in Weave Online are going to be acceptable to someone, right? Those are exactly the kinds of priorities that are Yeah, okay.
Betsy, I have a comment. I also want to join the chorus of voices thanking you for a very good illuminating talk. So in our department meeting this morning, somebody made a point that maybe we could substitute instead of the darn administrators, the neoliberal agenda seems to have an argument and then finds data to back up its argument. And we have to keep, in terms of resisting, asking, is there other data that we need to be looking at as well, rather than just the data that's coming down on us? It's fitting a pre-formulated argument based on efficiency and based on downside or whatever, right? And we have to start, as educated people ourselves, asking questions about what other data and what other ways of looking at things are there, and not just sort of accepting, oh, gee, here's a good argument based on data. They've really convinced me. Instead, saying, why are they picking that data? And how come we're not reading these studies? We have to all participate in this data.
Did you follow the path of most resistance? Like, would you say your whole career? Or until you got
I'm a pragmatist, right? And so, yes, I follow the path of greater resistance in some cases, but I also understand that working within the system matters as well, right? And so I have chosen to continue to work within the system, in part because working within the system, in huge part, it's why I get to teach, right? And if I completely resisted the system, it would mean giving up teaching. And I am sure as hell not ready to do that. Yeah, Kathy.
I think the other thing, to go on with what Kathy was saying, if you work within the system, you get to decide what data to collect. And you get to be a part of how that data is presented. And that's one of the ways that we fight back to this, I think, is to start to say, because I actually was anti-assessment, I'm becoming more pro-assessment. I do it all the time in my classes because I can demonstrate, look at what my students are learning. And I take that right back and put it in their faces. If you think we're not working hard for our students, then why are they learning this? And that's where we use, the auditing bothers me, but I need to audit them back. I need to say, okay, per credit student, or per credit hour, or FTE, for whatever it is for administration, what value are our students getting from that new administrative position?
Exactly. So let's thank Betsy.